We are privileged to have our delegates and panelists with us. So I request if we can invite them on stage with a big round of applause. Firstly, I will be calling upon stage, as I'll tell you, us versus them is the session. For those who are in this hall, us versus them is the session. If you are really interested in, you can just sit. And we are calling upon stage, firstly, the moderator, Suzy. Put your hands together for Suzy, who would be moderating the session. Along with them, we have got Becca Heller. Becca Heller, thank you very much, ma'am, for being here today. And then Sir Mohsin Hamid, yet amazing yesterday, and we wish that it would be amazing today. And Leila, Aboulela. Thank you very much, ma'am, for being here today. And I wish if we can have a big, big round of applause for all the panelists today. And mic is over to the moderator. Thank you very much, ma'am.
I am an American journalist. I have been living in Istanbul, Turkey for the last 12 years. And I am a contributing writer to the New York Times Magazine and the author of one book, Notes on a Foreign Country, which is generally about why Americans do not feel a greater connection or sense of responsibility to their foreign policy and their role in the rest of the world, and why, therefore, they do not really understand what it means to be American. And I think we'll probably touch on that a little bit today, because I think we will at least mention once or twice Donald Trump and all of his own vast ignorance.
Who?
That guy. Otherwise, we'll be talking about immigration, migration, refugee crises, borders, and hopefully you will enjoy it. Thank you so much. I will quickly introduce our amazing panelists. We have such a great group today. Leila Aboulela was born in Cairo and spent her childhood and young adult life in Khartoum and eventually moved to Aberdeen, Scotland. She is the award-winning author of 5 novels, including Bird Summons, The Translator, The Kindness of Enemies, Minaret, and Lyrics Alley. Her latest book, a beautiful collection of stories that I can highly recommend, is called Elsewhere Home, and it's just come out in the States, correct? Or, yes, so congratulations. And Leila is also the first winner of the Caine Prize for African Writing, and she was longlisted 3 times for the Orange Prize for Fiction. So welcome, Leila. Becca Heller is a visiting clinical lecturer in law at Yale Law School and the co-founder of the International Refugee Assistance Project, or IRAP, to address the unmet legal needs of refugees seeking safe passage from one country to another. And I'll explain a little bit what the organization does, but she will explain it much more. IRAP organizes thousands of law students and lawyers all over the world to advocate for the legal rights of refugees and displaced persons. In the wake of US President Trump's executive order banning travel of millions of people from 7 predominantly Muslim countries, Becca and IRAP marshaled thousands of lawyers to go to airports throughout the US to fight the ban and protect people trying to enter America. So if you remember those images, it was, I think the most prominent images were from JFK, right? And Becca was the one who was organizing that protest against Trump's ban. And she has received numerous awards in recognition of her work with IRAP, including the prestigious MacArthur Fellowship, otherwise known as the Genius Award, which means Becca is a genius. And Mohsin Hamid, who I think you know, is the critically acclaimed and best-selling author of 4 novels, Moth Smoke, The Reluctant Fundamentalist, How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia, and Exit West, as well as a book of essays, Discontent and Its Civilizations. His latest book, Exit West, was a winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and shortlisted for many more prizes, including the Booker Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award. It also directly concerns, the subject of the book directly concerns our topic today. And I have to say, it totally convinced me. I was a skeptic of the possibility of open borders, but it definitely convinced me that it's not only a possibility, but perhaps an inevitability, and I found the experience of reading it just absolutely moving. So welcome, everyone. So I'm going to talk to everyone for a little bit individually, then we'll open up the questions to larger questions, and then we'll open up the questions to you. Leila, I thought we would start with you. I was curious about your own story. It was in 1990. moving from Sudan to Scotland. And what was that like? How difficult was it for you to make that move logistically and also emotionally? What happened when you made that move?
Oh, okay. Yes, I first moved in order to study. I came to London to study a master's in statistics and to do a PhD, and then I didn't go back. So I didn't really plan to leave Sudan. The idea was just that I was going to go, like many people, and get my degrees and then come back and teach in the university. But then once I was out there, there was a coup in Sudan which changed sort of circumstances, and there was also my husband found a job in Aberdeen in Scotland, and so we moved to Scotland. So I kind of like by accident found myself immigrating, and I think that that's what made it difficult, because it wasn't a decision. Mm-hmm. I think if you make a kind of studied decision to leave, and you prepare and you say goodbye and you go, then that makes it easier to adjust. But if it happens the way it happened to me, then you're not really sure whether you're staying, whether you're leaving, and it's kind of like vague and so kind of sorted out. And then for a while also we lived in, we traveled around in Scotland. We went to Indonesia, we went to the Gulf. So we were expatriates for a while, mm-hmm. which is much more, makes you feel better than being an immigrant, because it's kind of humiliating to be an immigrant for some reason. I had this experience as well, and then we went back to Scotland in 2012. Yeah. So I had a lot of homesickness at the beginning, a lot of culture shock. I do meet a lot of people who find it very difficult to make this adjustment. I think coming from a socially conservative, background, and coming from, being a practicing Muslim, it's hard to adjust to life in the West in a kind of a secular environment. And then, of course, there's the Islamophobia. There's all these other issues that makes it a little bit more difficult as well. Yeah.
And what was Aberdeen like at that time as a place to move to? I mean, were there a lot of other people from your community? Did you know other people from Sudan who had moved to that part of the country, or were there a lot of other immigrants there at the time? And what was the kind of atmosphere in Scotland?
There wasn't that many, and the kind of irony is that in Sudan, I moved within very, very westernized liberal circles, and then when I went to Scotland, and I found myself being pushed away, and I started to be less. I was actually interacting less with Western people and more with people from the rest of the Arab world or Muslims, and spending a lot of time in the mosque and things like that, just because that's where I felt welcomed, and so I just naturally gravitated towards there. And but the good thing, though, that happened is that I started writing. I had never written before. I was a statistics student, and so the move opened up this new life for me as a writer, and I started to write about, I wanted to explore all these issues I was talking about, and the anxieties and the cultural anxieties, and bringing up children, and losing their language, and all that stuff I wanted to write about. Mm-hmm. And fiction was just a wonderful way of putting these concerns, because immigrants don't have the luxury of talking about these things. When we get together, we don't talk about homesickness. We want to pretend that we're not here. Or we swap, tips on how to survive. Mm-hmm. So there isn't really this luxury of nostalgia or homesickness.
Why is that? Why don't you talk about homesickness?
Because once we get together, and it's only maybe in the weekends or whatever, we want to forget, we want to pretend that we're not here. We want to recreate You know, we want to eat our food, we want to drink our tea, we want to talk in the same way. We don't want to, we want to like forget it all, forget it. Or we just like help each other, you know, in navigating. But one of the things that immigrants don't talk about is the reality of the fact that they're going to stay here, that their children are growing up in this new place. And so there's a deep denial, a deep, deep denial, and that causes a lot of problems between the generations. So there's a lot of, you know, conflict because the child is growing up. And it's almost like they're adopted by the society, and they're living in these two worlds. They go to school and they get different values. They come home and it's completely different. Right. And so it's there's a, you know, a lot of dynamic things going on. Yeah.
Yeah, and did you find at the time, were you yourself reading a lot of books about the immigration experience, and then also noticing how that experience was talked about in either nonfiction books or in the press or in the sort of collective imagination? Did you feel that there was something missing that you wanted to address in your own work, you know, that was sort of absent from, or that you felt that probably people didn't understand about that experience?
Yeah, I immersed myself into reading all this wonderful fiction. Actually, there's a magazine called Wasafiri. Wasafiri is just brilliant, and it really was publishing all these, you know, the new writers, the immigrant writers. I thought what was missing was the particular Muslim experience, and particularly the kind of the practicing Muslim experience. There was very, very hardly any of that at all. So I felt that was missing, and that I wanted to write about that, because I felt that, you know, the kind of the average. I wasn't writing about you know fundamentalists or, you know, like extremists. I was writing just about the average person who has faith, who prays, who fasts. And I think there was a lot of people, I mean, in terms of numbers, there's a lot of people like that, but it's not really reflected in fiction that much. So I wanted to bring that, to add that to the what was available.
And what is Aberdeen like? I mean, I'm not familiar with it as a place. Were you able to find places to worship at that time when you first moved there? I mean, what kind of, can you describe it, and how the people, the sort of natives to Aberdeen, how they reacted to, you know, foreign communities?
Well, they didn't react much because there's very little of us. So it's a number thing. I think the hostility comes when the numbers grow and people become more visible. If you're still a small number, you're just in the background. Nobody really notices you. The mosque is what used to be a bank. It's not a purpose-built mosque. The ladies section on the mosque was in the basement. So I remember being sort of like underground in the kind of ghetto. That was kind of the feeling I used to get very much in those early years. Yeah.
And I noticed also in Elsewhere Home, for example, there's a story about actually a British man who returns to Sudan with his fiancée, who will be. Was it important to you to show that experience also of going in the other direction and sort of experiencing? Why did you want to include that story in the latest collection?
Well, after writing a lot at the beginning, I was very much writing from the immigrant point of view about Scotland, a character, Sudanese, or coming into Scotland. I wanted to kind of like reverse it and have a Scottish man going to Sudan after having met this young lady in Edinburgh, and he's going to go to Sudan to marry her. And I wanted to kind of see Sudan through his eyes. And so it was an enjoyable story to write, and I think I get a good reaction from it, because then people can relate to it, you know, better in a way. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a wonderful story. And were you surprised by, I mean, have you seen sort of attitudes toward immigration in the UK and maybe in Scotland specifically change over the years? And were you surprised by the kind of recent emergence of more nativist feelings, or were you not surprised by it?
I'm not sure about being surprised or not being surprised, but there's certainly more because the numbers are growing. You see, the numbers of immigrants is growing. There's now, like for example, in Aberdeen, there's a big community of Syrian refugees in Aberdeen. So, and a lot of foreign students coming in, because as the numbers grow, then of course the hostility grows. if there's, you can really measure what's going on with what's happening in the media. So if it's all quiet and everybody's talking about Trump and things like that, then you're walking in the street and it's 100% safe. If somebody's saying something in the media, then you know that, oh, this is going to be a tricky day. You know, you have to watch out once you go to the supermarket. Anything can happen. You can go to the supermarket and somebody could just, you know, shout at you because of something they've heard, you know, on the news. It's nothing personal.
Right.
It's all to do with the news. The buses in Aberdeen have the BBC News on all the time. So you're sitting on the bus and this is, you know, facing you continuously.
Right.
So if something comes up, then, you know, the people around you kind of react. So this is what it is to some extent.
Yeah, I'm very curious about this because there seems to be such a disconnect between the reality and the media, right? And I was wondering if the novel is one of these things that can kind of fill in that gap, that kind of disconnect in terms of imagining actually what the immigrant's experience is. Because it seems like in daily life, yes, people are kind of living together fine, but then they get sort of riled up by these things that they're seeing on, these lies that they're seeing on TV, for example. I mean, do you think of the novel as something that kind of, you know, plays a role in increasing a kind of empathy?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that fiction is a safe place to work out these things, you know, and that it does give this, you know, idea of empathy. I'm just not sure that whether the people who are reading my books, for example, are the people who I mean, they're open anyway. You know, they're already open-minded to pick up a book like this, to read it, to enter this world. They already moved a lot of steps, you know. So I don't think it's going to actually reach the people who need their minds changed. Yeah.
And I was just one last question. I was curious. What is the experience of young Sudanese today moving, are there, you know, sort of waves of refugees coming out of Sudan now? People moving for work. What are the kind of migratory patterns today?
Today it's different because I think the first choice for young Sudanese would be the Gulf states rather than Europe. I think they would prefer to go to work in Dubai, to work in, you know, Qatar. You know, that would be more of a preference than moving to the West. I think that has changed over time. And certainly, looking back, the people who moved to the Gulf states 30 years ago, 40 years ago, they've done better than the people who immigrated to the West, financially speaking. I mean, materially speaking, they have done better, and they have remained connected to Sudan. So you know, if you're a young person now, you can kind of judge that better. Yeah,
that's very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you, Becca. I was hoping we could talk about today and the situation in the U.S. and elsewhere. But can you first talk about the founding of IRAP and, you know, leading up to your confrontation at the airport with that man?
Yes, we had a personal confrontation. Sure. So I actually co-founded IRAP while I was a law student at Yale Law School. It was the summer of 2008, and I kept reading about all of these Iraqi refugees who were in Jordan, and felt that as a US citizen, I had some kind of obligation to understand the humanitarian fallout of the Iraq War. So I basically kind of wandered into Jordan, which in retrospect was a little bit of a problematic kind of social justice warrior, poverty tourism way to approach the issue. But I guess if I hadn't done it, I wouldn't be sitting here right now. And I arranged to meet with 6 Iraqi families. And I didn't have any kind of agenda. I really just kind of wanted to learn about what was happening to them. And I thought maybe I'd go back and write like an opinion editorial for like the New Haven Register or some other like bastion of investigative journalism. And I had done a lot of kind of humanitarian work abroad before, and so what I anticipated people's needs to be was primarily things like, you know, a lack of access to adequate housing and a lack of access to good education and food insecurity, and all of those things were definitely present. But what really struck me is that I think for most refugees, your primary problem is essentially a legal one, which is that no state will have you as a member, and that you sort of people probably, do you guys know the song Closing Time by Semisonic? Did that make its way to Pakistan? It was a big song in the 90s, and it's about like when a bar closes down and the bartender is sort of going around and saying it's closing time and you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. And I think that actually really adequately sums up the legal plight of refugees, which is that no matter what country you're in, it's like, okay, well, you don't have to go back to Syria or back to Afghanistan or back to Iraq, but you can't stay where you are. And I think, you know, the process for refugees of finding a safe place to go where you can kind of call home, whether or not it's your original home, is really mired in this crazy legalistic bureaucracy that's basically unnavigable. So I felt like in my like bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, overly optimistic, self-important Yale Law student way, that perhaps that was something that law students could assist with. So myself and a group of students ended up starting to try to help refugees try to navigate this legal process.
Because there wasn't an organization like this.
Well, I thought there must be at first,
Yeah.
right? Because you're essentially, like, the way I see it is that you're on trial for your life. You're going through an adjudication, right? You're going through a legal process, and at the end of the day, someone's going to make a decision based on evidence you submit and based on your own testimony. And as a result of that decision, you're probably going to live or die, right? If you have to go back to Homs in Syria, you could quite literally die. And to me, if I were on trial and the death penalty were at stake, the two things I would really want were procedures in place to make sure the trial was fair and a really, really good lawyer. So it seemed sort of obvious to me that someone had said, okay, in this context where there are millions of refugees going through this sort of life or death trial all the time every year, like someone surely has said, you know, there ought to be legal aid. So I spent the first kind of year of this work trying to figure out, okay, who else is doing this so we can just volunteer with them, and ultimately really realized that no one had done this before.
And so what happened when Trump issued this decree? Was it at that time 7 countries in the beginning, or did it expand?
Yeah, so Trump was sworn in on a Friday, and he took the weekend off to play golf, because he takes being president really seriously. And his first full day of work was a Monday, and we got the travel ban, or the Muslim ban, depending on how you want to call it. I call it the Muslim ban. Was leaked to us. Someone took a photo on their phone of a desktop computer monitor inside the White House that had the text of the ban on it. So we knew what it was going to say, but we didn't know when it was going to become the law. And we have, you know, IRA, my organization, like we have clients from all over the world, but predominantly from Muslim countries. And so we start calling all of our clients and saying, you know, get on a plane. Like the doors to the US are closing, we don't know when, get on a plane.
Because it applied to anyone from these countries, whether they were refugees, whether they were anybody. Okay.
Yeah, you could be, you know, Melania's parents, for example. Who he did at one point try to accidentally ban from coming into the country. That was a fun thing that happened. And then someone was like, guess what, her parents can't get status now. And then suddenly no one was talking about banning family-based migration anymore. Okay. It's fun times everywhere in the world right now. And so we were kind of trying to track our clients, you know, because when you get granted refugee status, it's actually a pretty, you know, as anyone in here who's been an immigrant will know, like leaving your home forever is a really big deal. So it's not like you get refugee status one day and then you like walk through a door and are in another country, to pick a random metaphor. You know, you sell everything you own, you're wrapping up your entire life. It like takes a long time. And we were sort of telling people, like, if you ever want to come, like it's gotta be now. And then throughout the week, you know, we don't know what day the ban is going to come down, so we're trying to track like what's happening to our clients each day. And that Wednesday we had a transgender client. And usually with transgender clients, we worry about what happens to them when they exit, because like, let's say like when I'm born, they say like, I'm a girl and my name is Becca, but then later when I'm like 22, I realize that I'm a boy and my name is Mohsin. I can't...
As happened to us. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then I go on to, you know, write some novels, and, you know, blah, 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 that are not remotely semi-autobiographical. I reject that entirely. But I can't, you in most countries, especially most refugee-producing countries, I can't go to my government and say, hey, I've realized that I'm a boy. Can you please issue me a passport that says I'm a male? And my name is Mohsin. So you are in serious jeopardy when you're exiting your country of getting stopped for having a fraudulent passport just because you're transgender. And this time we were really worried that the person was actually going to get stopped coming into the United States. And they were going to say, why are you traveling on a fake passport? Like, you're a woman, but your passport says that you're a man. So we're like, oh, we better go put a lawyer at the airport to make sure that this woman's able to get in okay. And then later that night we had this I want to use a different word, but I'm not. We have this holy cow moment of oh, it's not just this woman, it's going to be everybody on a plane, that whenever the travel ban comes down, there's going to be thousands of people in midair who, when they took off, had legal permission to enter, and when they land, are essentially going to land as illegal immigrants, and nobody knows what's going to happen to them.
And so what was the outcome after the ban came down? What were you able to do? And what is the situation now at this point for the people from these 7 countries, if you can say?
Yeah, unfortunately, the initial outcome was better than the long-term outcome. We ended up organizing thousands of lawyers to go to airports all over the countries, and they did end up actually, people landed and they just arrested all of them. They held them at the airports, they tried to detain them. We filed a lawsuit within about 14 hours, and the judge ordered people released. They released 2,100 people that they had turned the airports into giant jails, essentially, and they had been holding over 2,000 people. The administration then ended up just taking it back. They didn't even have to get sued. They're just our bad, we take it back. And then they reissued a ban with 6 countries, and in the end, the Supreme Court upheld it as legal, so the ban is in place. Okay. And a lot of Americans, I think, don't actually know this.
Right.
I get asked all the time, oh, what was it like to defeat the travel ban? And I'm like, we lost. I have no idea what it was like to defeat the travel ban, because, millions of people still can't get into the country.
Okay. And has it affected people from other countries as well? I was curious about this for example, other Muslim countries that are maybe not on it, but has the whole process been kind of stymied by this?
Yeah, so I've met a bunch of people this weekend who found, you're an immigration lawyer, oh, I have this pending visa, and I'm in administrative processing, what does that mean? And I'm like, oh, it means you're screwed. This is my Know Your Rights presentation. When we were talking about what to do at this panel, I was like, oh, I could just do a general counseling session for everyone in the audience, which is don't come to America until 2021. But yeah, they've basically introduced what they call extreme vetting, and I'm conscious of our limited time. I'm like, what's the synopsis of this that's not the nerdy lawyer synopsis? Essentially, they want to know everything about you ever, and it's stuff that I wouldn't know the answer to myself. They're what's every passport number you've had for the last 15 years?
Oh, really?
And I think most Americans don't know the answer to that question. And then they have to vet all that information, and then they basically just don't do it. They sit on it forever, and then they don't have to process your visa.
I was curious if you could just take us through maybe one case. I think that you had one that was about to come down this week. Actually, the decision was about to come down. Sort of, what are the legal obstacles? What do you have to do in order to fight these obstacles? And this whole experience, has it given you faith in the American judicial system, or has it shaken your faith in the judicial system?
Those are 2 radically different questions. We have a case, so I don't know if people have heard about the child separation policy at the US-Mexico border, where in an attempt to sort of deter Central American migrants from trying to come up to the US-Mexico border and claim asylum, the Trump administration has been taking children away from their parents. And it's happened to an unknown number of kids, basically. At first they thought it was 400, and then it keeps turning out that it was there's 1,000 kids that we lost track of. That was literally a New York Times article 3 days ago. It's there's 1,200 kids, and we don't know where they are, but they're someplace. So we actually brought a lawsuit on behalf of 3,000 kids who are still in Central America, but have a parent in the US, who the Obama administration had said could come in order to avoid them getting trafficked over the border and then detained, and then Trump had revoked permission for them to come in. And we won that lawsuit about 3 weeks ago. So we had an argument before the judge saying, thanks. So then we had an argument before the judge last week saying, like, what does it mean that we won? Like, basically, do the kids get to come in? I'm really superstitious. It went pretty well, so now we're kind of waiting for the order. So I've been obsessively checking my phone. In terms of whether I have faith in the judicial system, I mean, no. I'm someone who went to law school. Like I went to law school because I believe that you should use the master's tools to take down the master's house, and that the master's house is built on like the fiction of the rule of law. But it has given me weirdly like some faith in the American people. I think the reason that I highlighted that the Trump administration sort of took back the travel ban on its own without a lawsuit. And the same thing happened with the child separation policy at the border. Like in the end, the American Civil Liberties Union won a bunch of lawsuits about it, but they actually pulled back the policy before anything went to court, just because like so many people kept showing up and being like, this is not okay. Like, this is not what America means to us. And I think, obviously what America means is a complicated and loaded question, especially with this audience, I assume. And reading your book has made me hyper neurotic about that question, to be fair. But I just think like what gives me some hope is the fact that like with some of the worst examples of the policies that this administration has come out with, like the things that got it turned back was just like enough of the US population like caring enough to stand up and saying like, this is un-American and we won't take this. And also that actually moved the needle. Like that's what got the policy overturned and not the court. And I think that if democracy is anything at all, that's what it is.
Thank you, that's hopeful. Mohsin, you have written very eloquently about the idea of open borders. I count myself as someone who's very skeptical about this possibility, probably because I'm an American and I know a lot of those anti-immigration types in the US. But when I was reading your book for the first time, really truly, it was such an imaginative reading experience that it suddenly struck me that it was almost similar to the concept of climate change in a way, that for so long there were all these people that resisted this idea and thought it was crazy, and then there was this tipping point because there was this kind of massive flood of information, and then we all saw what was happening outside the window and this kind of thing. And I wondered, is it possible that open borders is that same kind of idea that just takes time? And what do you think about that?
Well, I think that closed borders is also a thing that got invented. Nobody would be living in Pakistan if there were closed borders because Homo sapiens didn't evolve in Pakistan. We'd be all living in the Rift Valley in Africa, quite a congested 7 billion people on a little piece of land. And so we invented these borders. We invented the passports, we invented all this kind of stuff. And I don't think it's working out so well. This invention is a century old, doesn't seem to be doing a great job, and so why not say, okay, let's try something else. Climate change, you mentioned, is going to make mass migration. Well, we already have mass migration, but the great mass migration that's occurring right now is between the countryside and the cities of the south, where hundreds of millions of people each decade move from the countryside to the cities, to places like Lahore. And the cities effectively, not in China, but in most places, have open borders. People like Imran Khan, whose family is not from Lahore originally, none of our families are originally from Lahore, comes here, settles down, and does okay for himself. He is both a Lahori and a Pathan, and he is a beneficiary of Lahore's open borders. I think that migration has been happening. And now what we're seeing is a migration also between the south and the north. And we'll see more of this, as sea levels rise and climate change occurs. And there's a kind of justice-based argument that says, well, because the vast majority of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was emitted by the north, and therefore the climate change is a direct result of those actions, that these people have a right to proceed north. But there's also, I think, a different argument which we don't articulate very often, which is what it would take to stop them and what we gain from letting them come, from stopping ourselves and letting ourselves come. If we want to stop the movement, we will have to construct increasingly totalitarian societies. And we have the capacity to do so because technology is making that increasingly easy to do. And so the question is, to keep our countries the way that they currently are, in an ethnic balance sense, are we prepared to build Gestapo-like police states using perhaps an algorithmic AI-based version of the Gestapo, but still with real prisons and goons and guns and walls? I think for many people that's not a super appealing vision of the future. And alternatively, what do we gain from letting them come, from letting us come? Well, everything that we know about our current civilizations, human civilization, is because people came. Everything we have is because people came. My skin is brown because lighter skinned people came to a place which had darker skinned people and over the millennia mixed to make brown people. America is a result of this migration, Australia is a result, India is a result, Egypt is a result, Sudan. So if we can begin to think, well, all the progress you have made, everything that we have seen is the result of mongrelization, hybridization, a man and a woman and a man having a child and mixing their DNA to create that child, is the essence of what we are. And so there's a horrific version of trying to stop it. There's also everything that we love and care for and like, which has resulted from it occurring since the beginning of Homo sapiens, which we need to continue to champion and have some faith in.
And in your novel, I mean, I know you've talked about this before, but of course you do employ a kind of magical realism, Becca just talked about all of the logistics of moving from one place to another, but you use these kinds of magical doors that the couple and the entire world can kind of slip through from one place to another. That is, I think, one of the main reasons why the book allows you to imagine this new world, actually. And so what was your thinking behind using those doors?
Well, in Exit West, the novel has these black rectangles, doors, through which people can pass. And if you step through one, let's say in Lahore, you will emerge in Kinshasa or London or Sao Paulo. And people begin to transit through these doors. I think that the doors for me were a physical manifestation of something that already exists and is increasingly existing on our planet, which is a radical interconnection and destruction of the notion of being rooted in a particular geographic area. Almost everybody in this room will have on them a black rectangle, which is the screen of their hopefully silenced phone. And that will currently be connected to via WhatsApp or text message or email or Facebook or something. People all over the place. And in your daily lived experience as a human being, you are being connected to places beyond your geography incessantly. This is already how we live. Nobody lives where they are. Very few of us actually live where we are. And so what does that mean? It means a couple of things. One, it means that this notion of geography separating us from one another is beginning to collapse. It also means that there's an incredibly powerful desire in humans to transcend geography. That's why we have this stuff. Otherwise, we wouldn't have it. Airplanes exist, not simply because the physics of airflow over a wing creates lift. Airplanes exist because people wanted to fly. And so people want to be wherever they want to be. So the doors were, in a sense, a way of imagining a world that corresponded to our existing technological and cultural reality, just a bit more so. And I think the last thing I just say about this is they're a mode of compression, because right now, one of the things that we face is how do we, in a attention competing environment in the marketplace for attention, how do we communicate things? We require compression to cut through all this stuff. And so the Doors were a way to compress the next century of human history into, a year.
And in terms of the people who resist some of these ideas, so in your novel, the couple, they go to England, they go to the US. I was wondering if you could talk about those two places. What strikes me about it is that part of the reason why some Americans and maybe some British people have trouble with the idea of immigration or the causes of immigration is because they themselves are not very conscious of their own foreign policy and their own imperial policies. But I was wondering how the two countries differ in that. I would think that the Americans tend to be less conscious of what they have done in other places around the world, and therefore they can't make sense as to how did these people even make a connection between us and them. Do you see a difference between the two places and how they think about these things?
There are differences. There are also similarities. I think, Pankaj Mishra had a wonderful essay recently about how the line drawers of partition have now, through Brexit, imposed upon themselves or their descendants precisely what was being imposed all over the world, and the kind of chaos that's going to result from this will be a manifestation. In the United States, I think there's a radical claim to equality that America has always made, which is at the best of what America is and the best part of the US Constitution. That has always been undermined by the radical denial of equality to large segments of the population. America and Europe, and I think many societies that like to believe they stand for human equality, are coming up against the inevitable contradiction that human equality and national exceptionalism are mutually incompatible. In other words, you cannot deny the equality of the child on your border and send your child to nursery school and say that you live in a society that believes in equality. That is a tension that is going to split things apart. And then you pick. Are you for racial supremacy, apartheid? What's the, within the white community we must have equality, but that's an apartheid-based, separate but equal way of thinking. I think those tensions are coming to the fore. And I think in some ways, countries like Pakistan have a chance to also rethink things. It's not simply what's happening in America. We in Pakistan have millions of Afghan refugees, and the thing I'm probably most proud of in Pakistani history is the fact that 3 million Afghan refugees in the 80s were accommodated by Pakistan with relatively little backlash in a poor country. But what do we do now? How can a country like Pakistan say to these people that you are not Pakistani? What is our basis for not giving them citizenship? How can we ask people to protect the rights of Pakistanis abroad when we don't have it in our... So I think that it needn't be that the cutting edge of morality on these issues is determined in the West. It could be determined here if we have the courage to do that.
It was something I wanted to ask about because of course I live in Turkey, and Turkey has taken in millions and millions of Syrian refugees, and it went from a country that was opposed to a lot of ideas of migration, and then they accepted this decision when Erdogan made it, and they're living together. It's not perfect in any way, and a lot of it is miserable, but they're doing it. And actually, I spoke to an academic who compared Turkey to Pakistan, and also I think Iran in the 80s, and how they were able to deal with these refugee crises differently. And do you see some commonality at all? And we can also, Becca, if you want to answer that too. Do you see a commonality between these countries, maybe Pakistan and Turkey, some difference in the way that they cope with these crises or the way that they think about them?
Well, I'd love to have the rest of the panelists weigh on this, but just, I think that the underlying notions of superiority that sit semi-unexamined not semi-unexamined, but unexamined by some in countries like America or Britain are different here. Pakistan has its own economic, racial, gendered hierarchies, horrific hierarchies. And certainly if there were millions of Hindu refugees, would Pakistanis find it within themselves to treat them as well as the Afghan refugees? I would like to say yes, but I actually think the answer would probably be no. That said, whatever mechanisms we find to break down these hierarchies are important, and clearly Iran, Turkey, and Pakistan have found some mechanisms, whether that these are our Muslim kin, or it is just that these are our neighbors, or it's just that we don't necessarily feel that they are beneath us, that the Syrian is not beneath the Turk, the Afghan is not beneath the Iranian or the Pakistani. I'm not sure, but I think when you see countries with tiny numbers of refugees seeing their political systems ripped apart, and then you see countries that are proportionally holding 10 or 100 times more refugees somehow functioning, it makes one wonder if that political system that was being torn apart depended on a degree of enforced inequality and racial hierarchy that is very fragile.
That's wonderful. I think we've come to our question and answer time. So if you would like to ask some questions to our panelists.
Do they maybe want to turn the audience lights on so we can see questions?
Yeah. I can't see it all.
Maybe are there microphones out there? Feel free to hand them to someone.
Feel free to just
Oh,
yell.
there we go. There we go. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Mustafa Bilal. I wanted to ask this question about cultural identity and the importance of feeling at home, like do we need to go beyond that notion of cultural identity that I am an American or I am a Pakistani or I am an Indian? Because there isn't much difference in being an Indian and being Pakistani. We have so much similarities. And then in being a Pathan and being an Afghan, there is so much similarities going on there. Do you think we need to go elevate from that idea of having one cultural identity to move beyond this crisis of immigration and stuff like that?
I mean, I think it's a really good question. I think the issue is that there's a lot of different kinds of identities, and that you as an individual might prioritize your cultural identity, but that the entity that's making the decisions about migration is your government, and that your government may be primarily concerned with a national identity, and your government may feel, for example, that the national identity of an Indian and a Pakistani person is quite different than the cultural identity may assume. And so when you start playing with, and I think that gets to Mohsin's point about sort of the arbitrariness of borders, right? That they get drawn across, maybe very culturally similar places, but then you have to assume almost like battling national identities. So while like the individual people in those places may feel that their cultural identities are quite similar, and that may allow them to like integrate or assimilate or feel empathy toward different refugee populations, if the nation state is in a position where it has to kind of enforce those borders from a nationalistic mindset, maybe it doesn't matter how similar the cultural identities are.
One thing related to this, I think, is that we think of Indian, Pakistani, Muslim, Hindu, American as identity. I think it's very important that we recognize that the core identity of a human being is based on being a migrant, as somebody who moves through one moment of time after the other, where there's an impossibility in remaining in one's own childhood, in one's own 40s, and that we eventually migrate out of this life and we die. And that this sense of migration is actually a human universal. The other things we talk about may or may not be, but the idea of change, transience, ephemeral impermanence is something that we have to consider in building identity. And the other thing I think about identity is everybody is a mongrel. We are all hybrids. Nobody is pure. I mean, that's in Pakistan, which is the land, of course, of the pure. We know I mean, you're all laughing because we know what, just how true our individual purity is. But each of us is not pure because each of us has two parents. We were a mixing. We're all mongrels. And so I think now beginning to articulate identities that are based on being a mongrel, being a hybrid, being a composite, and also being a migrant, it might be these kinds of identities are much more open to all human beings to participate in than something like Pakistaniness or Americanness. And so thinking about how that could work, I think, is very important.
How about down here? Okay. You're next.
Thank you all for your insights. The issue of migration is one that, as I'm sure for several people present here today, deeply personal to me. I'm a current student at Duke University in Aboulela, and Muslim as well. My move was to study. We spoke about how some of your work, my question is for Suzy, I guess at the start, how some of your work revolves around, in whatever way, explaining to American people that nativist beliefs are not in line with what we say American values. Do you think it's useful to question nativist attitudes with a frame of reference that seeks to redefine what it means to belong to a certain singular identity? To explain, is it useful to still label something as being or not being American?
I'm sorry, can you just tell me again what the question is?
Is it useful to still label something as being or not being American? I guess that's the core of it. Start with your work sort of revolves around redefining the questioning nativist.
Yeah. Well, I think that primarily what I was concerned with was the fact that Americans mostly believe in a myth about themselves. That the popular notion in the U.S. is that there's this kind of myth of American exceptionalism. There's this idea that our role in the world has been somehow, and this will make everybody laugh, inherently benevolent, that this is because of our unique trajectory ourselves, and that we are going to bring the rest of the world along with us on this democratic experience, as long as you be like us. And I think that most Americans are not aware of their history in many foreign countries. They don't know how to incorporate that history into their idea of themselves. And I think it is a very specific American history, and I think that has been a very specific American experience that they have to grapple with and face more honestly, because this is why they can't make sense out of what's happening now at home. What is going on with Donald Trump is not a surprise, actually, at all. It's not an exception. It is kind of, an extreme version of an essence, I would say. And so I think that until people, especially those of us who grew up sort of towards the end of the Cold War and only remember that whole story as if we are victors and our way of life has won, et cetera, they have a lot of history to confront and to face who they really are. So I think that first we have to come up with a more honest definition of the American, and then we can move on after that. Yes.
Okay. My question is that being a right to migrate, if a person is not happy in his own place and he want to shift to other place, but it takes a complicated process which is costly too, and it takes time and too much stuff. And suppose he can't afford it, so what will he do? Will he spend rest of his life in pain and living among those who don't accept them? I mean, there should be some alternative or soft process for migration.
Do you want to say that?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, a lot of people migrate not because they have to, but because they want to. They want to better themselves, and it's an economic thing. They want a better lifestyle. They want better education for their children, and I was brought up to think that this is a good thing. That this drive to better yourself is actually a good thing, and you should go for it. But sometimes I think, well, maybe this is a greedy thing. Why are we always wanting more materialistic? At the bottom line, it is all a drive for materialism, and maybe we should question that. Maybe we should question the fact that why do we want to why do we need so much? Why are we not satisfied with the simple life that our, parents or grandparents had?
So it makes your life tough.
Yes.
If people don't agree with you and you don't agree with them.
Yeah, but you put up with it because you're getting a better material lifestyle.
Not material. I'm talking about in spiritual terms or other ideologies terms.
Okay, yeah. Well, I suppose everything has a price. I mean, you're going to have to, every path is difficult in that sense. Yeah.
Okay, let's take the next question up there, or right here.
I have really two questions. The first one is...
We just have time for one, yep.
So, my question is regarding something Mohsin said, which was regarding mixing. That only in a totalitarian society would there be less mixing or no mixing. So my question is, concentrating on Indian communities, especially Indian from Muslim majority countries, where they fail to mix. So there is this lack of mixing, usually in literature, in fiction, or around us to find examples of Muslim men going to Western countries and then trying to mix. But we find a lack of literature regarding women, mixing and glorification of that, and also pure numbers, women failing to migrate. What do you think about that issue? Do you think that's a problem? What's your view on that? How that could move that issue?
I think it was for you.
Is that for me or just generally for... Yeah, anyone on the panel who wants to take that?
I don't know if I fully understood the question, but your question was about integration and like the gender breakdown and how easily people are able to integrate into new societies after they migrate?
My question was regarding how Mohsin mentioned that mixing should be encouraged. So integration mixing, migrant mixing should be encouraged.
About assimilation.
About assimilation. So my question is regarding one, in pure numbers, women tend to migrate less from Muslim majority countries. And two, they tend to mix even less than that. You don't find any examples of that in literature, in Western literature, or fiction, or media. So my question is regarding that. What do you think about it? How that can be done? Do you think it's a problem?
Well, I think partly is that women were not, they go because they're following men. It's not that they decide that they're moving. Most of the women who go to the West are because their husbands are there already, or the husband's job has taken him there in terms of the economic migration. So in a way, it's not. It's a kind of like it's to do with patriarchy. They haven't made the decision themselves, and therefore that's maybe why they're not so active as you see.
I also think that's not that true anymore. I mean, I think with a lot of Syrian refugees, for example, it's predominantly women who are fleeing. Like early in the crisis, it was a lot of single men who were fleeing, and the idea was that like the men would go and try to make a place for the women to live. But as a lot of the men got sort of drawn into the fighting, or men got killed, or men got imprisoned for political activism, it was women who took their children and migrated on their own. So I think that the gender dynamics, even from like Muslim majority countries, of who's fleeing have shifted really significantly, especially in the last 4 years. And as far as ability to integrate, from the studies that I've seen, I haven't seen anything showing that women are any less able to kind of integrate and assimilate than men are. I think that you're at a disadvantage if you have a lower literacy rate or you come from a lower educational background. So if someone's like coming from a country where women in general are less educated than men are, that it'll be more difficult for them to pick that up. But I think educational background being equal, that most of the studies have shown that women are actually more successful at integrating in new countries than men are.
I think that we've run out of time. Sorry, everyone, but thank you. Thank you so much for coming to our wonderful panelists.